Well, hey there, gang. I got a really interesting one here today that needs some serious help. This is a Timberline guitar. Now, there is a more recent import brand being sold under that name, but this is an original handmade instrument from a Canadian luthier called Kevin Hall, and this one is from 1979. I'll start with this because there'll be questions. No, the trolls in the comment section did not send me into a pit of despair. I came in contact with the sap of one of the poisonous plants from around here, and what's under there is really ugly and you don't want to see it on video. You guys know I like to investigate the history of hand-built guitars and lutherie in general in Canada, so this is a bit of a treat for me for a couple of reasons. Kevin Hall spent time here in Hamilton. I don't know whether he grew up here, but he was definitely living here for a time in the 60s. He was involved in the local folk scene, and he was a serious repair guy, as well as a builder, at a time when there weren't a whole lot of either of those things in this country, or anywhere else for that matter. He worked at Waddington's Music downtown, and he did repair for a lot of important Canadian musicians. He fixed up a guitar for Terry Jacks. You guys know Seasons in the Sun? And he kept Stan Rogers' guitars going, and many other people. At a certain point he got into banjo building, and he formed the Ruby Banjo Company with some friends in Toronto for a while. In the 70s he got recruited by Martin Guitars to head up their warranty service department doing the major repair work for Canada. Martin actually had a Canadian facility in those years over in Scarborough, probably because he didn't want to deal with the border. So he did that for a number of years, and then he went out on his own in 1978, the year before this guitar was made, and started building under this Timberline name. And he kept on for years afterwards. He was mostly doing repairs. Like a lot of us, the repair work kind of overshadows everything and it makes it hard to build as much as we'd like. So I feel a kind of camaraderie with this fellow. Though I never actually met him, before this guitar showed up, I was aware of his presence. I knew who he was. I think this one is probably inspired by a Gibson CF100, which is a 1950s smaller-bodied Gibson, like an LG with a cutaway. Very nice instruments, good for finger picking, kind of rare. Very distinctive deep cutaway with a really sharp horn. It's the kind of thing you want to do some deep breathing exercises if you're going to attempt bending this one by hand. Three-piece back, kind of like a D35. When I first got a look at this guitar, it seemed really, really familiar to me. There was a kind of visceral memory experience. When I saw that cutaway and I looked inside, I said to myself, you know what? I think I did a setup on this guitar back 20 years ago in 2000 when I worked in a little music shop. That's the other thing. This guitar has layers of Canadian music history on it because it was owned by David Essig, who is a very well-respected Canadian musician, composer, songwriter, heck of a finger picker, did sort of a folky bluesy kind of thing in the 70s, and later sort of more rock contemporary music and folk elements. He owned his own record label. So, this thing has been places. It went out west, and then it was bought and shipped back here to Hamilton recently, and it experienced some damage along the way. No, sir, that ain't good. This is one of those things. Like, we mention it from time to time, but it's really true. Shipping a guitar is dangerous. I had one of my own creations go missing for a couple of weeks this past winter on the way to the customer. Like, just dropped right off the shipper's tracking. They had no idea where it was, couldn't tell us anything. We were ready to start filling out the insurance forms when it suddenly magically reappeared. So, it happens. And, I've seen a couple of guitars in the last few months that were packed well, and they just didn't survive the trip. So, keep that in mind. So this crack goes all the way from the tail block, and I don't know if you can see it there, but there's actually a cross-grain fracture that happened right at the corner of the block here. It's all the way around the guitar and up into the upper bout. And it's not in perfect alignment. We're going to have to do some squeezing to get this to fit back together properly. Fun times.
We'll venture forth into the heart of a deep and impenetrable darkness. Using the endoscope. This thing's actually pretty cool. I'm finding uses for it. There's a quick shot here of what seems to be a bridge pad transducer pickup. I'm not familiar with this model at all. It looks old, It's kind of oval in shape. Not familiar. If you know what this is, hit me up in the comments so we can find out. Scanning along the sides here, you can see light coming in from the exterior, and also the crack seems to have broken right through the cloth strips, the traditional side reinforcement patches there. It's a seriously long crack right in the center of the side where it's the most flexible, so we're definitely going to need to put in some support strips to keep it together and prevent it from buckling inwards if it ever gets leaned on. To prepare the side reinforcement strips here, I've got an offcut of spruce soundboard. Just going to check that out and plane it to about 3 millimeters thick. You don't have to make these things outrageously thick. You want to sort of balance the structural rigidity with lightness. I don't want to make them too heavy. I'll go ahead and joint the edges. Using a marking gauge here, I'm going to make these about 3/8 of an inch, 10 millimeters wide. That works well. Anything wider than that, and you have to start thinking about custom fitting it to the interior curve of the side, which isn't easy, obviously, in this case where I can't get in there to test fit it and really see if it's fitting properly. So 10 millimeters it is.
Remember my automobile analogy, talking about parts that wear out? How long should we maintain original bridge pins? Put a couple of these together, you got one bad-looking wisdom tooth.
Just taking some measurements to determine the height of the support strips. I need to deduct the thickness of the top and back, as well as the curved lining. Just using a chisel to put a little chamfer on the top and the bottom. I'll also plane a chamfer on the sides as well, just to knock that sharp corner off. Doing some test fitting here. I'm going to leave the cloth supports in place and glue these in between. I'm using hot hide glue here, and I want to be fast. So I get a good lake of glue on the surface, and I pump it through with a suction cup. I've already got my spool clamps laid out to the correct width, so I'm not wasting any time. If there are areas where the sides aren't in perfect alignment, I can use these little wooden wedges to push down the side that's too high. After the glue is cured, I can clean up any excess with a slightly dampened rag and also clean the side a bit. You can see how filthy it is. Before gluing in the side supports, I need to sand and clean off the interior surface really well. Some of the supports are easily reached through the sound hole. As I get farther down, though, it gets more and more difficult to get things in place and aligned. While I wait for some of those to dry, I'm going to try and clean up the top a little bit here. Someone used a polishing compound, and you have to be really careful, especially in areas where the lacquer has been cut to accommodate the bridge or the pickguard, for instance, because that white waxy residue gets in there and it can be very difficult to remove. You can see around the sound hole here where there's some washboarding from pick wear. That's all filled up with this white powdery residue now. I'm going to try and use a little pointed stick with some naphtha. Try to draw some of that out. I'm using a hemostat here at the very end of my reach with a brace that's wet with glue, and I'm using the magnet there to sort of act as a positioning guide till I can get that in spot. And then of course, you know, take the magnet off and oh boy. Fun. I do try to clean up any glue squeeze out here with a damp paper towel. I use titebond style glue on the interior braces like this. It's a little more forgiving than the hide glue. If you bang on it, it's less likely to break off or crack. It's not as brittle. It's good to give the glue a minute or two to set up and get tacky before trying to slide the magnets in position. And you can see that I'm also steadying things with the end of the hemostat. This is really finicky work, guys. It takes a long time to get it right. I'm going to stabilize that cross-grain crack along the heel block from the outside as well using thin super glue. And also any little dips or inaccuracies where the two halves of the side didn't come together in perfect alignment. In a crack this long, there's always going to be a few places that don't turn out perfectly level, so I'll use the glue and a couple of coats of padding lacquer and then sand back to fair out the surface. I'll do this a few more times and let it sit for a week before the final polishing, but it's looking pretty good so far. I'm going to say that's enough for this video. I'll be doing a neck reset on this guitar in the next week or two, so you'll see more of it, and then you'll get to hear it after it's all been set up. Thanks for watching, guys.